Good morning. I think we'll begin. I can tell that the late night cultural festivities have delayed some of us. It is an honor to be here, and I want to thank President Hewlêr for hosting this discussion. Our question today is, can the problems of the Middle East and the wider Arab and Muslim world be solved or helped from the outside? Estonia has been part of this mission and has lost more than a dozen soldiers in the field in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I appreciate their investment in this discussion. And it's all the more relevant with a coalition now that includes NATO countries fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria, a battle that continues despite all that we have invested over the years in these countries. Many of the political problems that gave rise to ISIS, even as ISIS is being beaten back, however, still exist. Bashar Assad is still in power in Syria. And there's other problems like an ongoing civil war in Yemen that barely gets any notice. There is the instability in Libya after an intervention there by by Europe, by NATO. And President Donald Trump is headed to Saudi Arabia in roughly a week to meet with Arab leaders to form what looks like to Tehran as a coalition against them. The upside, according to Saudi Arabia, is it could help bring a peace deal to Israel and the Palestinians. The downside is it could pit a new alignment of nations against another alignment. So we want to start with the question of what is the most practical way to bring stability in Syria and Iraq, and therefore the region? And we will start in order of shares with Dr. Kortunov.
Well, thank you. First of all, let me say that I'm really privileged and honored to be on this panel and to speak here. And this is a huge topic. Let me start with one prediction. I think that when future historians write about our times and they try to single out the single most important problem of early 21st century, this problem is not going to be Russia. The conflict between Russia and the West is artificial in many ways. It's not going to be China, because China is already too integrated into the global economic system to challenge it. I think it will be Middle East. We have 4 million people, 400 million people in the Arab world only. We have very rapid demographic growth. We have unresolved social problems, incomplete modernization. We see a region which will be affected and is already affected a lot by the climate change. We see a region which does not really have a plausible economic development model. And I'm afraid that what we see in the Middle East right now is just the beginning of a very long and a very difficult political and social transition. It will be with us. And let me emphasize, it's not a regional problem. It's a global problem. Unfortunately, this is not well understood in the world. My second point, I think that we should really demonstrate certain modesty here. A lot in the region will depend on the internal dynamics. And I hate to say that, I don't want to sound condescending, but the internal dynamics is not positive. We have crises in Syria and in Yemen and in Libya, but what if a major Arab country implodes? What if something wrong happens in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia? This is not impossible. The consequences will be very, very serious. My third point is that to the extent external powers have an impact on the situation in the Middle East, unfortunately, the impact is not very positive. I visited practically all major capitals of the region and of countries which are engaged in the region, and I can tell you, and let anyone here challenge my assumption, that no one has a strategy. No one has a solution. We are guided mostly by situational interests. We are competing against each other rather than trying to resolve this immense problem. And I think that this is deplorable. This is something which demonstrates short-sightedness, something that demonstrates our inability to think strategically about the region. Now, what should be done? Since my time is very limited, let me be very brief, and maybe we will discuss these issues later on. I think that we should keep in mind at least 3 fundamentals. First of all, it's a complex and interdependent region. You cannot take problems sequentially. You cannot say that today we will try to address the Syrian challenge, tomorrow we'll handle Libya, the day after tomorrow we will have some time to think on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. It's not going to work. I think that the trick is to handle all these issues simultaneously, especially when we're talking about the Eastern Crescent, you know, what they call in Arabic Al-Mashraq al-Arabi, the Eastern Crescent of the Arab world. These countries are interconnected, and they had to be dealt in with simultaneously. Second, I think that though it will be very difficult, but we have to take an inclusive approach, not an exclusive approach. For example, many people in the Arab world will say, you know, why should we get Iran on board? Iran is such a difficult country. It doesn't belong here. It's not an Arab country, after all. So Iran should be pushed out. But, you know, without getting Iran on board, there is no way we can provide for a stable arrangement in the Arab world, neither in the Gulf, nor in Syria, nor in Iraq. So I think the trick is to find this very delicate balance of interests that will not be perfect, will not be ideal, but at the same time a balance of interests that would keep major players engaged. Major players in the region and major players outside of the region. How to keep the interest? We don't know whether the United States is going to be involved in any serious way. My third assumption, and here I come to Europe, I think that especially in the Middle East, it is very important to keep in mind that you cannot separate security and development. Most of the security issues that we face in the region are based in the failures of social and economic development. So you cannot fix Syria without addressing pending social and economic problems of Syria. You cannot handle Yemen if you don't have a plausible social and economic strategy. So the question is, if I might put it in a rather blunt way, where the models and the funding will come from. If you take you know, the situation today, it's definitely that neither Russia nor the United States is able or willing to commit serious resources to the region. So essentially there are 2 sources we can talk about. We have the Gulf states and we have the European Union. So I think that that gives Europe a certain leverage that it should not waste, because this is an opportunity to have a say, and a very serious say, in the future of the region. Thank you.
Essentially, bargaining with aid to come to some sort of stable political solution.
Exactly, exactly. At an early stage of the conflict, when the options are still open.
Minister Mikser.
Well, a very good morning to everyone. The question posed by the organizers of the conference was whether the Middle Eastern situation can be resolved from outside. First, well, the Middle Eastern conflicts have very often been sort of artificially lumped together as if it was a one Middle Eastern issue that needs to be resolved. It's been described as a sort of mother of all the conflicts in the world. I think it's we should refrain from sort of describing it in overly mythical terms, the situation in the Middle East. Sometimes, well, and then we should also be very careful in lumping it together as such, because I think when you look for a common denominator, for example, between the conflict in Libya and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then I think such a common denominator is very difficult to find. Obviously, some of the conflicts we can say have been sort of created with the help from outside. Quite often you have to go back to World War I to sort of see how the external powers actually artificially divided or put together, say, regions and people who naturally should have belonged together or did not belong together. Also, more recently, I think that when you look at the situation in Syria and Iraq particularly, well, those two situations, I think what they have in common is that the most recent sort of turmoil and bloodshed started with attempts, on one occasion successfully, on the other not so, to topple sort of authoritarian minority rule. And in Iraq, it was well done with the considerable help from outside. In Syria, there was the outside world was sort of hesitant when the popular uprising against Bashar Assad's rule started. Well, I think that there are definitely limits as to how much the external players can do, and there are definitely very different motives, very different motivations for different outside players, and some of the outside players have rather sinister and sort of sinister self-interest in the attempts to intervene. I would be quite so blunt as to suggest that Russia does have the predominant motive of Russian involvement in the Syrian situation is to maintain a strategic foothold on the Mediterranean Sea, and the support that Russia has been giving to Bashar al-Assad and his regime has been predominantly sort of motivated by that rather narrow self-interest. So I think that when we try to see whether outside powers can actually help to resolve any particular situation, then we should ask whether that this or that outside power actually is motivated by the genuine interest of a conflict resolution or something quite different. Also, I think when you look at the Iranian motives, and Iran obviously, I mean, is a major power that can definitely not be discarded when we look for some sort of a resolution in Syria. Again, I do not think that there is a great overlap with what we see as the sort of the interest of the majority or the plurality of the Syrian people, or the interest of the European majority of the European nations. Obviously, I quite agree that there's a very direct nexus between development and the stability or conflict, the possibility of conflict resolution in the Middle East. I don't think that when necessarily when future historians look back at this time, this period we are going through right now, that the Middle East is necessarily going to be seen as the outstanding security issue. I think that it's quite possible that the continent of Africa will, and the situation that is sort of developing in the continent of Africa will actually, from some distance, be seen as a far greater issue. But nonetheless, I mean, for this sort of immediate stability, including political stability of the continent of Europe, the situation in the Middle East has a very direct and serious implications. So I think that while we are interested for also our own interest of keeping the situation under control, maintaining a modicum of stability in the Middle East, Europe as a sort of predominant player when it comes to the ability to deliver soft soft power, well, has again very difficult dilemmas that we will have to resolve when we try to use that leverage that the soft power gives us. For example, when it comes to any sort of post-conflict reconstruction effort in Syria, I think that is going to be a rather difficult sort of square to circle or the other way around when we think of how much sort of reconstruction assistance we are ready to give to a Syria where the people or groups who are responsible for horrendous crimes against their own people remain in power or remain a part of some sort of any sort of power sharing arrangement, or to a country where other outside powers who are not ready or not able to participate in significantly contributing to this reconstruction effort actually want to maintain significant military presence or even control over the regime that's going to be in power. So I think that there is a role for the outside players, definitely, particularly when it comes to contributing to development and finding the sort of minimum modicum of stability. But obviously the interests of different outside players, regional and global powers, differ very significantly and are in sort of inherent conflict with each other. So there's definitely a limit as to how much the outside powers can actually contribute to the solution.
You bring up two important points: outside aid and past examples of outside aid. We've given billions as an international community to both Afghanistan and Iraq, and neither country has been able to make good on that investment, arguably. And you also bring up the point of proxy wars. How can people who are waging proxy wars inside these nations to further their own interests really represent or help find a path to peace for the peoples who are living there? Two points we can.
Well, I would say that also when it comes to, for example, the sort of central, sort of historically, the central conflict in the Middle East, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, then we are trying to advance what we call the Middle Eastern peace process. Whereas I think that the parties to that particular conflict see it, well, they also have come to use the term Middle Eastern peace process, but it's not so much about peace, it's much more about territory. And I think that also with other conflicts, we sometimes when we seek a resolution, we forget that those conflicts, not all of them have started because of the missing peace. They've started for very different reasons, and I think that we have to find a way of addressing the root cause of any of those problems as well.
Deputy Prime Minister Şimşek, of course, you are an insider who has to deal with the interference of outsiders. Your view.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. This is my first time. First of all, I do agree with my panelist colleagues that we have to be humble. This is, probably one of the most complicated, difficult conflict or challenge. So in terms of, addressing Middle East, I think one has to be, it has to put things in a context. But first of all, Middle East has been the cradle of civilizations. But in recent centuries or years, it has had more than its fair share of conflicts and tragedies. And I do agree with my Russian colleague that we have to have, a more, regional. I mean, we cannot pick just one conflict on its own and say, hey, this is the solution. So to answer your question that was posed to the panelists, So far, foreign intervention, unfortunately, has not helped, partially because it lacks strategy. There are tactical positioning, but it lacks long-term strategy and solution. I think that's important. Usually, outside interventions are not principled interventions. Let's pick the West in general, or Europe or United States. They tend to think that their principles don't apply to that region. You know, the fear of Islam gets in the way. They prefer to support dictators, military juntas, over, you know, what people probably on the ground prefer. And that has led to lack of a system in the Middle East that would cater for the needs of youth and people in general. I think, you know, when you look 30, 40 years down the road, you know, the risks are huge. Between now and 2050, you're going to get 183 million working age population added to what we have today. And what we have today, already youth unemployment is north of 30%, 35%. This is a huge tragedy, but it's also a huge problem. I think the security of the West and the security of Europe in particular starts in the Middle East. And unless Europe and the West in general are sincere in addressing these problems, this place will never be safe. 900,000 Syrian kids that are school age in Turkey, out of 3.6 million refugees that we host today, unless they get hope and decent education, you know, training for the future jobs, they'll be exposed to extremist influence. So my point is, you know, in the West in general, we think that democracy, you know, tolerance, fundamental rights and freedoms, rule of law brings prosperity, quality institutions. So why don't we think that it's relevant for Middle East when it comes to Middle East? So this is one, that's what I mean by a principled, upholding our own principles here. So West found it very convenient to support a dictator in Egypt that disrupted, let's say, you know, democracy, and they thought that this was perfectly fine.
Which one?
Egypt.
No, which dictator?
No, I mean, there was a military coup. An elected president was DC. No, this is what, I'm just giving you an example. So the point I'm making is the West find it much more convenient, instead of trying to coexist with Islam, the fear of Islam gets in the way. I think we have to be very open here. So that's first. Secondly, in general, what I see is that you pick ethnic groups, sectarian groups, like you pick football club. This is extremely dangerous. Why? Because Middle East is so rich in ethnic and sectarian groups. And if you start dividing Middle East along those lines, essentially you're calling for perpetual conflict, for a permanent conflict. So that's not a way to solve problems. And again, we're seeing the same mistakes being committed over and over. Today, United States in Syria is committing the same mistakes that they committed in Afghanistan, in Iraq. This is very classic. That's another one. Why? A lot of times they don't have a strategy, and they don't know the region to the extent that they claim they don't. And finally, Islam and West. Clearly, the Islamophobia or religious intolerance, I would say, that is now on rise, the far right in this part of the world, is going to make it even more difficult, because the center is losing ground to far right. And so the involvement, you know, is now going to be on, again, a principled sense. So the role of Turkey, I know that's also being debated. We sincerely want a more stable, more democratic, and more prosperous region, because it would be in our interest. Turkey is by far the largest manufacturing base, non-oil or gas economy in the region, by far the largest. And we would benefit most for more stability and prosperity. Turkey itself is ethnic and sectarian group-wise extremely rich. And we're trying to address our own problems. Ethnically, I'm a Kurd. Up to the age of 7, I couldn't speak a word in Turkish. My parents were illiterate. I come from a very humble background. My parents were doing subsistence farming. And we do have a large Kurdish population. Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city in the world. It's not Erbil or Süleymaniye or Diyarbakır. And it's northwest of Turkey, the furthest point in the west in Turkey. My wife is a Turk, and I have 3 kids, and I'm a Kurd. This is a classic Turkish ethnic composition. How can you solve, let's say, Turkey's own problems without more democracy, fundamental rights and freedoms, rule of law, and tolerance? You can't. But one thing that you can't solve is by dividing countries along ethnic and sectarian lines. And today, this is exactly where it seems that the region is headed. And that is another, so essentially we're planting seeds of future conflicts, permanent conflicts. So the answers to your questions is that outside influence or interventions so far have not been helpful at all, because they lack principle, they lack strategy. Secondly, if we're sincere, then we should apply same values. We have to really advocate long-term transition to democracy, fundamental rights and freedoms, and prosperity, quality institutions, rule of law. Same things that we want in Europe. So that brings me to the solution. Solution is European model. In Europe, you had First World War, you had Second World War. Prior to that, you had many conflicts. Millions of people lost their lives. But at the end, you were able to bring, maybe hundreds of different ethnic groups, 28 different countries, and different sectarian groups together based on these principles, universal values, and create a region or a union of 500 million that currently live in peace, harmony, and prosperity. The same can be achieved in the Middle East, but we have to overcome our own prejudices, our own preconditions. And that's going to be by far the most difficult in my view going forward.
Yeah, I've really been restraining myself over here because there's a lot to dig into that statement. The first couple of things that spring to mind are the fact that the Bush administration did try to impose democracy in a couple of different regions, and it didn't take or it didn't work. The other thing you could say is Europe right now is in turmoil. Some of its countries divided between ethnic groups that have come in from the outside and have not assimilated, a problem with refugees where it is rejecting people from the outside. So lots to dig into there, but I don't want to derail things before we hear from Dr. Mirkhan. You're up.
I just want to say that it's a privilege and honor to be here. It's my first time in Tallinn, beautiful city, friendly people. A flashback to the history. When the final seal on the French-British dispute over dominance of the region was placed by the League of Nations on so-called the Mosul question in 1926, the mission was led by Estonian general. I hope I pronounce it correctly, Juhan Laidoner. And the information was presented that the Kurds did not want to be subjects of Turks and Iraqi. It's a privilege to have another Kurd here and to be sitting with you. The privilege. So I was the first, and the second historical coincidence was that Estonia regained its independence in 1991. The the Kurds of Iraq, the place that I came from, was first recognized by United Nations in 1991. And now you're to be the head of the European Union, so hopefully there is a message there. Okay. So I'll be very brief. I'll talk about the causes of the conflict and the consequences and my predictions. My colleagues, they very well they addressed the issue, but I think the first point is that the political map doesn't represent the realities of the Middle East. I'm not going to go through the history, and I try to be very pragmatic and to the point. There is what is seen now in the Middle East, that there is no culture of democracy and liberalism, and there is no culture of coexistence. On contrary, there is a culture of retaliation and revenge, unfortunately, which is very rare if you look at the history of the Middle East as a cradle of a civilization. The fourth point is there is an identity crisis. Nationalism would be the answer. How they think for their identity. The Mr. Minister says that I'm a Kurd and I'm from Turkey. It's brilliant. I wish we had the same opportunity in the other countries, like Iraq, for example, the country that I came. And the last point is governance. There is a lack of a good governance in the Middle East. And the consequences is there is a rise of new actors, sub-state actors, and very dangerously non-state actors. And in August 2014, the Kurdistan region has found himself share more than 1,000 kilometer borders with a new state, Islamic State. And we didn't know who are they, what is their agenda, but we know that they are the brutal terrorists. And in 1 month, we suffered the consequences. There is a sectarian polarization, and there is no unity in Sunni area. There is no unity in Shia area. There is they don't affiliate themselves with the state that they live in. And the next consequences is that internal issues are no more the internal issues. And external issues are no more external issues. And for example, given the case of Iraq and Syria, and the issues and dilemmas of Syria will have the impact on Iraq and Iraq immediately, and vice versa. And we have seen the phenomenon of failing state in the region. State, it's out of their capability of the states to protect their people and their territory. For example, 3,000 militias, terrorists of ISIS, they came and they collapsed 6 brigades of Iraqi army. $15 billion of NATO countries' commitment and training to Iraqi military forces just vanished in 24 hours. So what are my predictions? I think we will see a new Middle East order. The past order will stand still, but we are on the verge of a new Middle East order. Internal boundaries between communities will change. The rise of ISIS and military jihadists has very dire and long-term consequences. There is a lack of trust between communities. Just for an example, a Yazidi community who've been betrayed by some Sunnis will never find trust, which is a very, very challenging, would be challenging matter in the future. I think external border will not alter, and the exception of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. and I'll come to that maybe next time. So I think no ethnic and religious communities will become a state except the Kurdistan region, and we will find more ongoing conflicts. And my colleagues will address it very comprehensively. But what we will find out of that conflict is we will find a more predictable rivalries and competition. And it's just like the shaping ballast of power in 18th century Europe. And we will find that external actors like the US, Russia, and the regional powers like Turkey and Iran, they know how to deal with internal issues. And that invisible hand of that balance of power will make sense in a couple of years. We'll see the more proxy wars, unfortunately, and I think foreign powers will share the focus on the Middle East, and there will be no transformational approach to the Middle East. They will find out that they have to deal with what's going on the ground, and you very well addressed the Bush doctrine, the new conservative doctrine that to export democracy in the region. That's not going to work, and the foreign and regional powers will come up with a solution that the only short and long-term solution would be to share their responsibility to add to assist the countries of the Middle East to increase the good governance, rule of law, and inclusiveness. I think that's my predictions, very briefly.
So you point out all the reasons internally that a solution applied from the outside wouldn't necessarily work, but the meddling will continue.
Yes, my approach is more of inside out than outside in.
So you have all brought up the need for a strategy, or the need to know what right looks like in the end. Yet the U.S. intelligence community every couple of years comes out with something called the Futures Report. And every single one of these reports, it says that when you look across the Middle East and African region, you see an increasing fight for resources driven by climate change that will drive population migration, low-level instability, fuel terrorism, and criminal networks. So how are you going to stop it in its tracks across the Middle East? I mean, what is your strategy? You've articulated the need for one. Can you throw one out there?
Well, if it is a question for me.
Minister Şimşek.
Well, thank you. I think when you look at Middle East in general, so let's define the problem, and then maybe obviously I would suggest my own strategy. When you look at Middle Eastern economies in general, they lack diversification. Even though some of them are extremely resource rich, they've not been able to diversify their economies. And population in general is extremely young. In some countries, 70% of population is below age of 20. I mean, so very young, and working age population growth. So these two issues, lack of diversification and such a young population, unless you have a good development strategy, this is a ticking time bomb, and it needs to be addressed. The best way, of course, is to have governments that are responsible to their citizens, accountable, and therefore use resources on education, skills, R&D, infrastructure, so that development takes place, and improve investment climate to lure capital from capital exporting countries. So in the region, there are certain countries that are exporting capital because they cannot use all those surpluses internally. And there are those who are in need of massive resources. So my point is, it all starts with reform. But reform cannot come in without a lull or an end to all these conflicts, chaos. So we go back to the first question. So we can't really treat your second question without addressing the first issue. What I was referring to was this. Arab Spring actually included lots of hope. It had a good start. Had we all, I'm speaking in general, West, treated Arab Spring the way it treated, let's say, the collapse of Soviet Union, when former Eastern and Central European countries came out of the cold, how they were embraced, how they were helped, how they were treated and encouraged, along that path. We had a real opportunity, but that opportunity has been missed. In Syria, Obama's policy is mind-boggling, hard to understand, including the response to chemical weapons. In Egypt, the Western attitude is extremely hard to understand.
But arguably, the U.S. in Egypt, they embraced the government of the Muslim Brotherhood when it came in, saying, well, that was democratically elected, so we'll support them. In Syria, they let Bashar Assad do what he thought necessary with his own people, though they protested it. They sort of stood back and let things take their course. How would you have treated that differently?
Arguably, obviously we may differ here. I think it is clear that West very strongly backed the coup. There is absolutely no question about it. In Egypt, in general. I think most people would agree, but so I would disagree with you. I don't also believe the idea that Bush was in Iraq to export democracy. The whole basis for intervention in Iraq was false.
You mean it was self-interest? It was protecting them from a
mass
threat.
Destruction. The whole it turned out to be a complete fallacy. But that's not. I'm not here to. I'm just trying to make sense of where do we go from here. I think we should apply the principle that we think serves us well to Middle East. We shouldn't think that Middle East lack of a democratic culture. It's not in our DNA. Our DNA doesn't. Turkey has this democratic experience. We may not be perfect. We genuinely, over the last decade and a half, tried to solve our complex ethnic or other issues through more democracy, more fundamental rights and freedoms. But I would also, again, argue that terror gets in the way. And unfortunately, today's approach, the United States is using a terror group to fight another terror group. US
So you're referring to the fact that the U.S. is in alliance with the YPG. So
yes, it's like using Al-Qaeda network, Al-Nusra, to fight ISIS, same thing.
And of course, as Defense Secretary Mattis would disagree with you,
No,
Minister.
actually, I think they would admit that PYD-YPG is the cousin of PKK. They do agree.
Respectfully, I would say that we should not be engaging in a sort of West bashing here. Because obviously, Western powers have made their mistakes when it comes to attempts to sort of figure out the Middle East. But I think that the primary reason for this conflict and also for the rather dire socioeconomic condition of the region comes down to a massive failure, monumental failure of leadership in most of those countries. I think that obviously West can and should play a more constructive role and more perhaps insight and try to sort of look at it with a bit more what's the right word I'm looking for? Well, creatively perhaps as to how to contribute in a positive manner to the resolution of those conflicts. But I really do not think that we can impose a solution here. And obviously, well, you can say that the West has been supporting a leader in one country that has not been sort of popularly elected against someone who, well, you can say was. On the other hand, it suggests that we should have worked with Saddam, who, well, definitely was not a leader enjoying a popular support of his own people, and was a leader, well, even with or without chemical weapons. In the early 2000s, he was a leader who had started two regional wars in the past. So I mean, it's I think in a region broadly, it's been a huge failure of leadership, and actually, I think that there is a sort of different. Well, the European model obviously is a very good model, and I think that democracy could and should be able to work in the Middle East. The European path to this relative peace and tranquility that we enjoy today, and I think it's quite relative and it's quite fragile at this point. Well, the European path to that was through 2 world wars, and I would say that many in Europe would argue that those borders that emerged as a result of the First World War, when Europe came out of this phase of those multi-ethnic empires, and then the map that was redrawn again as a result of the Second World War, did not reflect any sort of God-given natural arrangement.
And
so I think that obviously, I mean, some of the borders drawn on the map in the Middle Eastern region are artificial, but aren't all the borders more or less artificial. I think that an attempt to redraw those borders now so as to make them reflect some sort of natural reality, I think is bound to result in even more turmoil and tensions and bloodsheds. So I think that we should work with the regional players in order to promote democracy. We would not be able to impose it, and it's very important that the powers or the societies also understand that in Europe or in Western democracies, the legitimacy of the state power is derived from the popular support that is sort of manifested through elections. And not everywhere in the Middle East it's perceived the same way. I think that much of the legitimacy of the powers comes from their ability to exercise control over the societies. That's very different reality, and that's why we sometimes fail when we try to sort of say that we should resolve the situation by promoting elections. And if we have free elections, then we've more or less solved the problem. It hasn't worked in many places, I think, just like that.
And if I may jump in to pivot to Russia, Russia is now a major player in the Middle East. It's reasserted itself, and Russia is not a fan of liberal democracy. So, Dr. Kortunov, would that be a solution that Moscow would impose or back?
Well, I think that when we are talking about ethnic, sectarian, religious problems, minority rights, essentially history knows only 3 ways to approach these problems. The first and arguably the best way is to provide for basic human rights. It means democracy, it means decentralization, it means autonomy, and it is definitely the best way. In many cases, it doesn't work for a variety of reasons. The second option, which is definitely inferior to the first one, would be to do what I would call ethnic cleansing, to exchange populations. If particular ethnic groups feel uncomfortable living in one place, of Syria, for example, Sunnis move to Raqqa, Alawites move to Aleppo, they exchange populations, and then they can have some kind of home rule. And the last option is to redraw borders. to change borders. I think that if you take Middle East, we have to explore all the three options. Though I agree that in terms of changing borders, it would be better not to touch them to the extent possible, except probably for the independent Kurdistan, but even independent Kurdistan is perceived by many as a time bomb that would explode the whole region. So it would be nice to have democracy there. I cannot speak on behalf of Russia, but I am a strong believer in liberal values. However, I think that given the current circumstances, we will have an exchange of populations to come to more homogeneous units, which will be able to sustain themselves and to find some kind of accommodation with Central Powers. But let me also, since you gave me the floor, make one more comment, which is of historical nature. I don't know whether Carl Bildt is still here, but if he's not, let me tell you about the Bosnian model. What happened in Bosnia? There was a war, a very bloody war. Not of the scale that we have right now in the Middle East, but it was a pretty serious thing based on ethnic, religious, confessional differences. And in the end of the day, outside powers got together and stated their will. And their will was that, look, if you are ready to live together, and this is how this map will look like, if you are ready to cohabitate within integrated Bosnia, we will incentivize you by providing some kind of technical assistance. But if you are not ready, we will punish you. And we are ready for a military intervention. And not only we will punish you, but we will punish your neighbors if your neighbors instigate instability in Bosnia. We are ready to impose sanctions on Serbia. We are ready to impose sanctions on Croatia. So no violation of the agreement will go unpunished. And what we see in the Middle East is exactly the opposite. Instead of trying to contain the conflict, outside powers fuel the conflict by supporting sectarian forces. So in my humble opinion, I understand that Bosnia cannot be compared to the Middle East, and Bosnia is not really a success story. But I would still emphasize the need to come up with an integrated approach and to curb the violence. If we do not fuel the conflict, the level of violence will go down. It will still be there, but definitely, local players, if they are deprived of this permanent assistance, will find it much more difficult to maintain the current level of violence that we have to.
So let's get into some concrete questions as we also open up to questions to the audience. You said it's bad to support certain sectarian parties, but arguably Moscow is supporting Bashar Assad. That's contributing to continuing violence, and he's a minority Alawite regime controlling a rump, what's left of the Syrian state. So is that contributing to stability?
Well, I think that it's a kind of a game which is played by everybody. In Moscow, they would say we contribute Bashar Assad only because West supports his opponents, and if we withdraw this support, his opponents will have the upper hand. And the other way around, of course. And I think that's exactly why we need an agreement that would involve all external players, and they should have the same rules of engagement, or rather, the same rules of disengagement.
And I actually, in terms of concrete solutions, of course, there's been the proposal of safe zones.
That's right.
Recently agreed by Russia, Turkey, and Iran.
And the United States.
Well, the U.S. was considering joining in when I last checked. Minister Şimşek, do you want to make some news here and give us an update on it?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think the priority in Syria has to be to have a more permanent lull in violence, because that's really the beginning. And that's what Russia, Iran, Turkey, and to some extent that the U.S. is involved now is trying to achieve. So the Astana process, I think, is a good start, because we have to have, as I said, a ceasefire.
Though of course, the U.S. really wants to transition from the Astana process back to the Geneva process.
But that Geneva could be the latter. It could be the next step. So first you have to Who have the leverage on the ground? These 4 countries right now have leverage on the ground. It's true. So if those 4 countries get together, work sincerely, they can achieve a lasting lull in violence. That's the beginning. Then we can talk about how to move forward from here. Ideally, I mean, as far as Turkey is concerned, whether it's Iraq or whether it's Syria, we believe that the way forward would be more inclusive, more democratic, but countries with territorial integrity. As I said, if you begin to divide countries along ethnic or sectarian lines, you will not be able to get out of this. It's so complicated because these countries are so rich in a diversity. So we should treat the diversity as source of richness. And that's why I said we shouldn't pick up ethnic or sectarian lines as the way we support football clubs. And I didn't mean to bash West. I think West can be in general. I think Europe, should be more involved. Europe has a lot of soft power. Should be more involved. Europe can help with building institutions, gender equality, education, reconstruction. We're ready to do that. We're ready to commit huge resources. The fallout for us has been massive economically. So we would also prefer actually to spend that money in building peace, in building those cities, in building those countries.
I want to get to some questions from the audience in the time that we have left. Dr. Mirkhan, did you have a quick point?
Yes, I think the regional problems are no more regional, it's international. For example, terrorism and migration crisis. So, and there is a study done by UNHCR, for example, carrying and sheltering a refugee in Iraq and Syria will cost us 10 times less than carrying, sheltering them in Europe. So the probably better idea would be to invest on their reliable partner in the region. Therefore, my recommendation would be that Russia and U.S., Russia, and regional powers should treat the Iraq and Syria more strategically. They should work on those the point that there are kind of disputed points. For example, there should be a new status or new constitution in Syria, guarantees the right of all of communities, and there should be a plan for fostering ethno-sectarian inclusiveness. I agree with you, Mr. Minister, and therefore, I think the West and European countries should know who are the assets and who are the liability in the region. I came from Kurdistan, so I can give you some information. 1.6 billion IDPs and refugees were in Kurdistan region. It was equal to 30% of our population. And we were the front lines of the only military on the ground defeating ISIS. So the Kurdistan region have proven that they are the reliable forces, not only for regional but international powers. So we have to focus on the land of stability and coexistence. And maybe we could focus on other valuable values in the next step. I agree with you with the comment that inclusiveness is very, very important. And for Iraq, it's very important to have the implementation of federalism. There should be a rule of law. What I see in the Iraq is the rule of personality, not rule of law. And there is no federal...
But of course, in Iraq, you're not going to get the majority Shiite population to vote for federalism. So what, would that be imposed from the outside?
Well, now there is a federal state. In 2005, the communities of Iraq, except Sunnis, they agreed to be partners in Iraq. What I see here there is participation, but no inclusiveness in Iraq. So there is no federal state. I think there is no federal government, but a central government. And I don't know it's a bold statement or not, but the Sunni community in 2005 were in the stage of denial. They were ruling the country for 500 years. Suddenly they were told that you're no longer welcome in Iraq. So they should have, my point is short-termism is a problem that even not Sunni and Shia and Kurds, they don't see any grand strategy from the main powers. But when it's come to Kurdistan, the roadmap is pretty clear. They want to protect themselves. Given the last century, for example.
Well, you had said that in the Kurdish region that there was probably going to be a vote. There have been calls for a vote, but what happens if your area calls for some sort of breakaway, more official breakaway from the central Iraqi government?
The Kurdistan region the president of the Kurdistan region asserted this very clearly. The reason that they want to have independence, which I think they're going to have it in a very short period of time, let's say in 5-6 months, is to know what the constituencies of Kurdistan will think of their future, whether they want to stay with Iraq, or they want an independent, or they want a different status within Iraq. So they want to find a common ground between the discourse and activity. So they want to align their discourse with the will of their constituencies. I think that's the reason of their independence for now.
And I also misspoke when I meant the Shiite government would object to a federal government. I'm thinking of the partition plan that is discussed off and on in Washington, D.C. as a way to finally get the three communities to cooperate. But the problem is the Sunnis, if they're separate from the Shiite areas, really don't have resources.
The problem is there is a participation, but there is no power sharing. That's a problem.
Can we open up to questions from the audience? Sir, in the back. Please wait for the microphone and identify yourself.
Yeah, Peter Samnaby, I'm the Swedish ambassador in Lebanon and chargé d'affaires in Syria at the same time. I have a question primarily directed to Andrey Kortunov on Syria. You talked about the need to deal comprehensively with the Middle East, but at the same time one should, of course, not have to manage the individual components, and Syria is the most burning conflict that we see today. I would like to ask you how you see the possibilities of a Russian-American understanding on how to move forward on Syria. What will be the gives and takes of such an understanding? And if there is such an understanding, how what will that understanding be on the future role of Iran in Syria in particular?
Who would like to dig into that?
This is not a small question.
Yeah.
Let me tell you that there are short-term goals and longer-term goals. If you recall the Lavrov-Kerry negotiations in September of last year, the attempt was to deal with the level of violence. And I think that these negotiations left an aftertaste in Moscow. The perception, whether it is right or wrong, it's another question, but the perception was that basically the agreement coined by the Department of State was overruled by Pentagon, namely by Ash Carter. And the US military simply, destroyed this agreement. So now the question is whether we should get back into this deal. However, in terms of give and take, I think that the take basically the solution would be to get back to the political transition modalities in Geneva. Because if you listen what they say in Damascus, there is no reference to Geneva. They want to win the war. And I think that the official statements coming from Moscow definitely imply that you cannot win the war and you have to engage in a political transition. And then you can talk about the modalities of this transition, the future of Bashar Assad, the constitutional arrangement, the regional environment for this. So it is important to re-legitimize the political transition plan, the document that was signed in Geneva a couple of years ago. It is important for Russia because the only other way is to continue unconditional support for Bashar Assad. But I think that you put your finger on a very critical issue, Iran. I personally, and I'm not the only one, I think there are many people in Moscow who follow the current changes in the US policy towards Iran with a lot of concerns. I think that this tough position is not likely to work. They will have elections in Iran in a couple of days from now. Hopefully Rouhani will be re-elected. But you cannot act on the assumption that you can push Iran out of Syria and Iraq. It's not likely to happen. Even if Moscow fully accepts that, it's not likely to happen for a variety of other reasons. And I think that it is in our interest, and here interests of Russia and the European Union coincide, I think, fully. We should try to convince our American partners that they should demonstrate more flexibility on Iran. Because now in DC they say that the P5+1 agreement with Iran is not the best agreement. We should push Iranians harder. No, we cannot resolve this issue without Iran. So I think that in exchange for re-energizing the Geneva process and bringing the issue of Bashar Assad back to the table, the United States should demonstrate more flexibility in terms of the future Iranian role in the region. I understand, once again, that there is pressure from Israel, and Netanyahu has his influence on this administration. We understand that there is pressure from the Gulf, but I think that we should get beyond these short-term considerations and interests, because otherwise we will have a Cold War in the region, and this division between Sunnis and Shias will define the future conflicts, not just in Syria and Iraq, but also in places like Yemen, and God forbid in Bahrain and some other parts of the Gulf region, which we should try to avoid to the extent possible. Sorry for such a long answer.
Anyone else have?
Well,
Yes, Minister.
just one small thought. I think that we should exercise extreme caution when we are speaking about a comprehensive solution to the whole Middle Eastern situation, because I think that such a sort of grand bargain, a comprehensive solution, risks ignoring or overlooking legitimate interests of some groups or some communities that, from the point of view of this comprehensive solution, are perceived as marginal. And so I think that we should, while I agree that we should work on all tracks simultaneously, we cannot sort of try to resolve one conflict and then move on to the other. I don't think that there is a one sort of master plan, a comprehensive solution to the whole of the Middle East, and I definitely don't think that even if we find a sort of way to make the a coincidence of strategic interest of the U.S. and Russia, or U.S. and the European Union, that this would necessarily be acceptable to, or should be acceptable to all the local regional players. So I think that sort of an attempt to figure out a sort of grand bargain between the great outside powers and then impose that on the region is not, unfortunately, not sustainable on one end, and well, and not enforceable, I'm afraid. But also, I think that it's from the sort of ethical point of view, we should not attempt to do anything like that.
Okay. Question right here.
I'm İlter Turan from Istanbul Bilgi University. I actually have an observation to make that may possibly be construed as a question by the members of the
Well,
panel.
then please make it brief.
Well, yes, I shall make it brief. But I think what we are looking at in these Middle Eastern societies is not society, but communities. And our problem is that we are essentially treating these as societies when it is an agglomeration of communities. In the past, the reason why we've had such dictatorial governments is that communities have tried to hold other communities together, pretending that it's a society. And I think the solution would be essentially as much decentralization as possible in order for all communities that can relate to a national government. But because we tend to see the world as being comprised of nations, we actually miss the point that we are not dealing with an Iraqi nation, nor are we dealing with a Syrian nation. In fact, the reason why Mr. Minister and I, who is of Bosnian-Herzegovinian background, can fit into the same society is because we are a society. We're not an agglomeration of communities. So,
But that really gets into the question of how can you help build a society from the outside?
exactly, this is the point,
So
because
that is a great point. Doctor.
I really agree with this because in Iraq, for example, there was no path to nation building, but there was a path to state building, and it is a different. And those client state that emerged after World War I was given the authority was given to minorities of those countries, and those countries tried to be a so-called benevolent despot. They tried to, but that didn't work. So there wasn't a path to nation building in my region, in Iraq and Syria. I agree with fully. So, and that state building doesn't work. And so what is the idea of expecting a new result when you're doing the same, right? The same experiment.
But there has been the criticism also made of the Trump administration that it is returning to the practice of supporting despotic behavior by supporting the Egyptian President Sisi, and whose government has cracked down on people.
I think it was more of a crisis management than doing a kind of long-term agenda for the region.
When does crisis management become a long-term policy?
Well, it's not a long-term policy, but I think it's alleviating the already existing problem. For example, the European countries facing huge migration crisis. So what they can alleviate this kind of problem is to try to boost this instability in the region. So they try to kind of do this crisis management first, then looking forward for a more strategic plans.
We had a question over there.
Thank you. My name is Ala Olyum. I'm the advisor to the Managing Director for Middle East North Africa at the European External Action Service. If you allow me, I'll just make one observation, since Europe has been mentioned by a number of the panelists here. There is a strategy of Europe towards the region. Unfortunately, it's not towards the whole region we're talking about. It's called the Southern Neighborhood in our parlance, part of the European Neighborhood Policy. And there are some positive aspects of our engagement, Minister Şimşek, with the Arab Spring, and that is Tunisia in the first hand. The development in Tunisia should be seen, I think, as a model for the Arab world. The liberal constitution that was adopted there in a reconciliation between Islamists and secular parties, I think, should be also seen as a kind of a model which the Europeans have very strongly supported. I would like to ask, however, Minister Şimşek, that one of the countries that has not really been mentioned here, Israel, was for a long time a strategic ally of Turkey, and we have seen recently a reconciliation between Turkey and Israel. How do you see Israel, another great economy in the region, cooperating with Turkey to resolve some of the issues on development? What do you see the prospects there?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I do actually, we do appreciate the European constructive role in the region, so there's no question about it. But I think it isn't as comprehensive as one would have hoped, or it isn't as visible. There is selective, programs and targeted whatever initiatives, but not necessarily a whole, big picture. But anyway, that's a separate issue, I guess. Regarding Israel, I think we have mended fences. Israel is an important player in the Middle East. I think it would really help if one day we were to wake up and the Palestinian issue has been addressed. But we have to accept that Middle East, I think we should support and encourage democratization in general. That's what Europe obviously argues that it should be the case. But that should be part of longer-term strategy. We shouldn't get off track because of tactical reasons, because of other reasons. So that's my first. Secondly, ultimately, all the problems in the region, we bear the responsibility, those regional, people, rulers, countries. It's not, but outside involvement has been significant. And so the reason why we discussed the European role and others is because the first question was, is outside influence or intervention, can that help? Or has that been counterproductive? So we need to keep things in context. My point is, Israel, I think if they could agree to two-state solution, which the ground seems to be obviously a lot more ready for it, it would really help with the other conflicts. So Turkey is ready, and we genuinely have no interest in the region's sort of getting involved in meddling in their internal affairs. The only reason why we're party to the Syrian issue is because we have 911 kilometers of border. And the failed state in Syria has meant a fertile ground for terrorist organizations. And Turkey has been at the epicenter, or has been, bearing all that essentially damage because of terror. So Turkey couldn't sit on the fence. And we having to host 3.6 million refugees as we speak today. So Turkey is involved. With Israel, we worked so hard with previous administration to see if we could find a solution, including their problems with Syria as well. I think Iran, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, they're important local players. If we can get together and say, hey, let's respect territorial integrity, but let's create more democratic societies. Let's invest the money that we spend on weapons. Let's invest it in education, in empowering women, labor participation, building quality institutions. These are all what European values are, what Europe stands for. And I think Europe can play a bigger role even before a post-conflict, meaning at this stage. So my point is, with Israel, we've mended fences, but the economy, economic relations were never affected by the crisis. But clearly, we're still concerned about the plight of Palestinians, the treatments of Israel, of Palestinians. I think it is in Israelis' interest to create a more viable Palestinian state, to help create a more viable Palestinian state, to live together. I think that's in the long-term interest of Israel. So that's our position hasn't changed on that sense. But of course, we want less conflict and more stability in the region, and that applies to Iraq. People think that Turkey has quarreled with Kurds. We don't. I mean, my friend is here. He should tell. We were the first country to support the Iraqi Kurdistan to fight ISIS. We, at some stage, when I was finance minister, we helped pay Peshmerga's salary. We provided equipment. Turkey was the first country to actually help Iraqi Kurdistan fight ISIS. We have no quarrel with Kurds. We can never have it.
But Deputy Prime Minister, one of the questions that does come up, though, as Turkey says it's trying to help bring stability to other parts of the region, you're grappling with your own internal dissent. You have tens of thousands of people who've been arrested since the coup. A lot of complaints that those... I've interviewed people who say they've been arrested because they simply had $1 in their pocket. But without, because apparently this is a sign of being a Gulenist. So how do you help bring stability outside when you're grappling with this inside?
Well, thank you. This is an important question. Turkey has had traumatic experiences of the last few years. One of them was a failed coup, but there was a bloody failed coup. Nobody was arrested because they carry a $1 bill in their pocket. That $1 bill, the serial number, was for a military-grade encryption software that was exclusively used by the Gulenists. Gulenists from outside look like a benign, benevolent, religious movement that has a strong focus on interfaith dialogue, education, but deep down is extremely power-hungry and is more of a criminal network, and it has proven. But that's a longer story. I wish we had time. I'm happy to elaborate on that. Turkey has issues. Turkey has issues. But there's a genuine effort on our side, and we're very grateful to European process as well. That has helped, by the way. Europe has been a catalyst, has been an engine of change in Turkey. We try to address our own problems through more democracy, more fundamental rights and freedoms. For decades, Turkey was in self-denial, in the sense that Kurds exist in this country, in the sense that they should be treated, like everybody else, not being assimilated. But President Erdogan, my party, has put an end to decades of assimilation policies, denial, But unfortunately, the failed states in the region provided a fertile ground for PKK to have access to more weapons, more training, more recruitment, and it became a much bigger threat to even peace in Turkey. So Turkey's response to these threats, whether it's a coup attempt or whether it's a PKK terror, which is on UN and US terrorists, they should be taken within a context. Turkey is not backsliding, is not entering a democratic recession. Normalization is beginning. We are going to go back and strengthen rule of law, strengthen democracy. That's the only way forward for us. The only way. We have to coexist. We have some Alawite, in terms of religious diversity. We have Kurds. We have other ethnic. But Turkey, is pushing for a more democratic and more tolerant society. We have no choice.
So watch this space.
Yes.
Well, in the no minutes that we have left, I'd like to give each of you 30 seconds, a minute to wrap up your thoughts. I've heard things like, essentially what I'm hearing is the outside world can buy time for an internal solution, risks imposing an external solution that will probably not work, and most of all needs to provide some way for there to be jobs in the region to turn the area back to stability. That is my 30-second sum up. Dr. Kortunov.
Well, I think that the reality is that we cannot resolve the problems of the region from the outside, and we have to be prepared to live with a very volatile, very unstable, and sometimes very risky part of the world. However, the impact of external powers is still significant, and we should not miss the chances that we have. And let me just make one more footnote to the statement made on Tunisia. I cannot resist this temptation because, of course, you can consider Tunisia as a success story, as a kind of window for the European Union Southern Partnership policy, but we should not forget that Tunisia today stands out as the single largest exporter of jihadists to the Middle East. They export more fighters than all the European Union together. Basically what they do, they outsource their own problems to places like Libya and Syria. And I think that if you think about your KPI in assessing the efficiency of the Southern Partnership program, we should include the statistics in your KPI as well. Thank you.
Well, coming back to the original question as to what the external players can or cannot do, I think that we should distinguish between at least three types of external involvement in those Middle Eastern crises. The first type, I think, which can be really useful and contribute to the solution, is the sort of involvement in those situations that is driven by a sort of humanitarian imperative. And that's actually, to a degree, what Europe did in the Balkans wars in the 1990s, with obviously having failed on a few times, we eventually did the right thing. And obviously, I mean, the European incentive is a very important aspect here, and we cannot incentivize the Middle East countries in exactly the same way, but nonetheless we can contribute, Europe particularly can contribute in a very positive way here. The second type is actually the involvement or intervention that is driven by a perceived threat to a country's own sort of vital national security interest. I mean, that the American intervention in Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks. I mean, you can contribute to the sort of long-term solution of the conflict or a dangerous situation, but I think that's not the prime motivator here. But obviously, I mean, when the countries feel that their own vital security interests are threatened by a turmoil in even a potentially distant corner, then they can be forced to interfere. And the third type is obviously when you interfere out of an entirely sort of sinister motive. You just want to grab territory or gain access to resources or create a new problem or turmoil outside the national borders in order to deflect attention from your own domestic situation, something like that. So, and that's by definition is not helpful to the long-term solution of any conflict. So I think that we should make that distinction, and I think that Europe, by and large, obviously there is a self-interest in trying to address the migration situation at the root, but by and large, the European involvement in the Middle Eastern conflicts is of the benevolent sort. And I think that we should not be discouraged by the fact that we have not been able to resolve all the conflict just as yet, or may not be able to do so in 5 or 10 years. So I think we should continue those efforts, definitely.
It's complicated. It's a tragic, but we can't sit on the fence. There's a lot that can be done. I genuinely believe that in the long run, the best path, and my colleagues also, probably they also said the same thing, is some sort of European model of, to some extent, some decentralization, but more democracy and fundamental rights and freedom. How do we bring that about? I think if the big players and some regional players, agree on this model and have the right, strategy in terms of, long-term strategy and then carrot and stick policy, it would work. There is nothing in our DNA, meaning the regional DNA, that suggests that we cannot be democratic, you cannot coexist and be tolerant. I mean, that in the past it was the case. So we can be, but we have to have, a sincere effort. We have to go beyond short term. Okay, let's just contain ISIS. That's right. ISIS is a barbaric terrorist organization. We have to contain it. But it doesn't finish. Don't create new ground, for another form of ISIS. This is what we're referring to. And that's where United States and Russia, can play a constructive role if they have this long-term strategy of actually working along these lines. That's where Turkey and others can help. and we're ready to help.
Thank you. Dr. Mirkhan.
Very quickly, there should be no transformational approach to the Middle East. Case of Iraq, Shias are afraid of their past. Sunnis are afraid they have a fear of the future. The Kurds, have a fear of their past, present, and the future. And that's the statement that said by the president of Kurdistan. So there should be a ethno-sectarian inclusiveness in Iraq. 2 days ago, Sunni communities, they asked for a federal region. They should be given that autonomous region. And we have to work on the more participating kind of governments. In Syria, all communities' voices should be heard. There should be a new constitution. And in the long term, the main power and regional power should work on the socio-economic of the young population in the Middle East. That would be the only path for a more future stable.
And if only they could recreate the success of Estonia after its independence with a young population, it would all be solved.
Beautiful, right?
With that, I want to thank the panelists, I thank the president, and invite everyone to go to a coffee break before the next panel. Thank you very much.